Okay, Irish fans, this is what you've all been waiting for. And as Trevor and I just mentioned before we hit the record button, almost surreal, especially if you've been a college football fan for a long, long time. College football playoff game on campus at Notre Dame Stadium, South Bend, Friday night, the kickoff game to the 2024-25 playoffs as well. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. Leave those comments and questions there in the chat. We will get to them. We appreciate the super chat contributions. We got Trevor Trowbridge from Irish Breakdown with us tonight. Trevor, it's nice to meet you. I appreciate you being here to break things down for us.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for having me on. It's cool. I've seen your show. I know when Brian's came on here, so it's awesome to have the opportunity to be here, man. I'm excited.
Absolutely. So before we break down the matchup against Indiana, we'll get to the news of the week, and that's a Devontae Smith, defensive back for Alabama, making his way to South Bend. And as I understand it, he's from Cincinnati, needed to get closer to home, so that's part of the situation as well.
Yeah, so he actually had a relationship from kind of being around Cincinnati when Marcus Freeman was the defensive coordinator over there. So he has some ties back to Marcus Freeman, which is pretty cool. But yeah, no, he's originally from that area, obviously a high caliber recruit, and he kind of fell off of Notre Dame's radar once the Alabamas of the world started getting involved in his recruiting process. And now he's, full life is kind of starting to take a swing with him, and he's looking to move closer back to home.
So as things develop in this transfer portal, and of course, this being a playoff team, and who knows, it's expected by certainly Vegas that they will continue to play past Friday, that there may not be too much movement one way or the other, players coming, players going, but long range as we may get into January. And obviously, the portal is going to have a dead period there, I think, from December 23rd to January 1st. What are you and others targeting as needs in the transfer portal or desires to go get?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at Notre Dame's roster as a whole, there's always going to be questions around the wide receiver room, right? I mean, just calling a spade here, Notre Dame's wide receivers room has had a lot of expectations going into the last couple seasons, and they've fallen short for just a handful of different reasons. So I think if that, one or two premier prospect pops up in the transfer portal, I think Notre Dame would try to make a run at them. But they have some really good guys coming in, raw guys, but their upside is really high. And they have guys like Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison and, the freshmen from this year, Cam Williams, Micah Gilbert, Logan Saldate. All those guys will be back with another year of experience under their belt. But outside of the wide receiver room, I could see them trying to target an interior defensive lineman because after the season, unfortunately, Howard Cross and Riley Mills are both gone. And those are going to be some pretty big shoes to fill. And in the moments where they've gotten in, Gabe Rubio has flashed, but he was hurt. I think he broke his foot before the start of the season. So he's had limited reps this year. Donovan Heinisch has actually been a nice surprise because Howard Cross has been out for the past about month. And in the moments that Donovan Heinisch came in and performed, he's done really well. I think his first appearance, well, not his first appearance of the season, but he started getting a lot more reps in the Florida State game where he ripped off 2 sacks. And then he got his first start the week after that against Virginia, where he had another sack as well. So I would say, just in a nutshell, I would go interior defensive line, wide receivers, and then I would say their nickel position, which they started to meet that need with Devontae Smith from Alabama. So I could potentially see them if the right prospect comes along, maybe getting another safety in the transfer portal because that safety room is going to be pretty young next year. They have a Don Schuler coming back who's starting this year, and then Luke Talek he's a rotational guy. I believe Rod Hurd is done, and then they have their 6'4" freshman coming in who's actually an early enrollee. I believe he started practice with the team this week, but he's a 6'4" freshman. He's an exciting prospect, so he'll be good to go for this upcoming year as well.
So, Trevor, besides the obvious, and when I say the obvious, I'm meaning a particular September afternoon in South Bend, I think maybe the second week of September, did this season pretty well play along the way that you had anticipated?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk around, what Notre Dame's record was going to be at the end of the season. There was a lot of talk about them being a playoff team. So if you look at it macro view, as I like to say, Notre Dame made the playoff. They went 11-1. They beat the teams that I thought they were going to. I genuinely believe Notre Dame was going to beat Texas A&M in week 1. But then the question mark was, who do they drop that one game to? Because I think, and I'm sure you can agree with this, Mark, like I think teams put a little bit too much emphasis sometimes on going undefeated. I think some people don't understand how difficult it is to win 12 straight football games. It's just easy to look at somebody's schedule and say, well, they shouldn't lose. It's like, well, in theory, not a lot of teams should lose a lot of games, but yeah, Notre Dame ended up going 11-1, which is what I thought. But again, like you said, outside of September 7th, I thought that loss could have came to a Florida State because they were a preseason top 10 team. I didn't know what USC was going to be at the end of the year. Historically, Notre Dame struggles when they travel out to LA to play them in the Coliseum. So, yeah, I was really interested to see who that was going to be to, and I did not think it was going to come September 7th. But here we are. It's the reality that we live in. But they rattled off 10 straight. They're in the playoffs and they're hosting. So, top level view, I would say, yeah, they met the expectations. It's just they took a different road to get there.
I would have to double check my predictions. I think I picked 11-1, and the way I usually do it is I don't pick every game. Now, I have had, because folks have pushed me to do this from time to time, to predict all the games and the exact record and the exact games, I should say, and where the wins and losses are going to come. But I generally look at like a Notre Dame schedule and say, yeah, between Texas A&M, Florida State, USC, okay, I see them dropping. Like going into the season, I thought they were better than everyone on the schedule. But the probabilities typically catch up with you and you drop one of them. Of course, the one that they dropped, nobody could foresee. So yeah, that Texas A&M game, I'm going to ask you about the offensive line, because obviously this has been an offensive line school for 10 plus seasons. And what they did the final 5 or 6 minutes of the fourth quarter against Texas A&M was impressive, considering they had very few starts. They were just molding a very young offensive line. That was a defensive dominated game, but they took control, put together 2 nice drives to separate from Texas A&M, put the game away. How has that offensive line looked the rest of the season and matured since then?
Yeah, I mean, it was weird, right? Because they've shown moments of being that vintage Notre Dame offensive line that everybody kind of knows, right? But then in other games and other moments, it's like, we haven't seen this type of offensive line in a while. Their progression in the run game has gone from a little bit of this to pretty steady. They're a really good run blocking team. And I think the difference kind of came when they paired up Billy Schrauth when he came back from injury. They moved him from right guard to left guard to be next to the true freshman Anthony Knapp. I think you saw a big change in the consistent play of the offensive line, because up until he made that move, you had a redshirt freshman and a true freshman starting next to each other, protecting the blind side of the quarterback there on the left-hand side. So, throughout their season, it's been more consistent. I will say in pass protection, that's kind of where it's still a little bit of this. They have their moments where they look pretty good, and it looks like they're getting their feet under them a little bit and they're playing at a more consistent level. But then they still have some moments where, they might have an issue picking up a stunt. They might have an issue picking up a twist. Some of that's Riley Leonard calling out pass protections at the line, and some of that is just more experience along the offensive line, because I think this combination is going into their 6th game starting together. Charles Jagasaw, the left tackle, got injured before the season started. Ashton Craig, the starting center, was lost for the season against Purdue. Billy Schrauth was out for a month starting with the Purdue game. And then when he came back, Sam Pendleton was moved out of the left guard spot. Billy Schrauth took over and Rocco Spindler stayed at right guard. So they're finally coming together more as a cohesive unit now, going into this game. But it's been a season-long progression, and I think it's even more heightened when you had 2 NFL draft picks at both tackle positions last year, one of them being Joe Alt, who went in the top 5, I believe. I think he went 4th overall, and Blake Fisher, who ended up going pretty early to the Texans. So, I think that kind of highlights a little bit more of what people felt like was a steeper drop off than what it was, because the offensive line is still good, right? It's not a bad offensive line by any means. I just think some fans know what the standard of offensive line play is at Notre Dame, right? And it's not at that elite championship caliber level yet.
So, Trevor, I'm assuming your most focused recollection of one Riley Leonard going into this season was, of course, a year earlier when Notre Dame went to Duke and came within a Sam Hartman, 4th and 16 run of getting upset on the road against Riley Leonard and Duke. I had the impression of him, and I've had this conversation with Brian going into the season, as this guy is an ultimate baller, gamer, will do whatever's necessary, gym rat, watches all the film, just loves his team, is loved by his team. Arm talent may not be quite where you would want it to be. Tremendous runner, all those things. And again, we'll lay it on the line. Your impressions of Riley Leonard's season?
Yeah. I mean, it was a big factor in Riley Leonard's play, to start the season was simply the fact that he wasn't able to practice in the spring. And when you're an incoming transfer, that's kind of when you're getting to know the guys on the field. And for him, he was taking a lot of mental reps. I think that was really tough for him. And throughout the season, it's kind of a story about his overall progression. And it's funny that you bring that up. I was breaking down kind of the comparison of the first 5 games to his, really his remaining games after the first bye week. And in the first 5 games, Riley Leonard passed for 750 yards. He had 3 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 65.8% completion percentage. But he also rushed for 374 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns. So early on, I was one of those guys that was just, look, for Riley Leonard, you have to pay attention to his total output, right? You can't just look at, well, this is where he's at as a passer, so that's how I'm going to formulate my overall opinion of Riley Leonard. But as the season progressed, he went from being 129th in the country in pass efficiency to now he's 38th in the country. So it's not like where it needs to be if Notre Dame wants to play it like a championship caliber level, because that has been a glaring issue for Notre Dame in the past. They've had the great defense. They've had the great offensive line. They've had the great run game. Elite level quarterback play is kind of what has plagued them in the past, right? Not to say that they had a bunch of bums under center, right? But they've had not that guy. They've had not the Stetson Bennett from 21 and 22 Georgia. They didn't have, I would say they didn't have the Joe Burrow, but nobody has Joe Burrow. You know what I mean? Didn't have Mac Jones for 2020, but what he's done since then, since their first bye week, he has over 1,300 yards passing. He has 13 passing touchdowns, only 3 interceptions. His completion percentage has gone up 3 points to 68%. And he's still finding ways to be a dynamic runner, but he has less attempts per game, but he still has the same amount of touchdowns that he did in the first 5. So I think you hit the nail on the head, though, Mark. I mean, he's a gamer. Like, he's one of those quarterbacks that just he does what it takes to win. He loves his team. He'll put in the extra effort. He's one of those guys that's first on, last off mentality on the practice field, right? So, Riley Leonard, from that perspective, has kind of been a blessing to the Notre Dame locker room. So it's been fun to watch.
Folks, we appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. We got Trevor Trowbridge on the line. Of course, you can catch Trevor and the rest of the crew there at Irish Breakdown. We appreciate Brian Driscoll being here every week, a good friend of mine, and Trevor filling the chair tonight. And so now let's get to this Indiana matchup. So your impressions of this Hoosier bunch and this odd coach called Curt Cignetti. I think he's kind of thrown us all for a loop to a certain extent, because when you're at James Madison, nobody's going to hear from you. And of course, he was an assistant coach before that. So I got to say that I've known the name forever, going back to his days with Nick Saban, but I never listened to the guy talk. And until, boom, he gets the job and he's at a basketball game calling out Ohio State and Michigan, not just Purdue, and letting everybody know in the Big Ten that he's in town and they're taking charge. So his team, I tend to think I'm not going to question his authenticity because I think he may well be like that in any situation. He could get the Alabama or Ohio State job and still act like that. Who knows? Or it may have been a calculated move that this team, this program needs some swag. They need a jolt. They need an infusion of confidence. Like, we're not going to be a doormat anymore. And this is so I'm gonna play up my act a little bit more.
Yeah, man. I mean, he's for all sakes and purposes, he's been very, very fun to watch this season. I mean, to your point, he splashed onto the scene and he's calling out other teams in the Big Ten and saying that they suck. And I think the basketball game that he was in attendance at was like the same weekend as the Big Ten championship game. And so I think he said, next year we're going to be there. And I mean, to his credit, they were like a game out from it. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's funny because I think it is kind of the jolt that this Indiana football program needed. Oddly enough, me and one of my buddies were talking at the start of the season. We were just talking about, just perennial bad college football programs. And like, unfortunately, Indiana was on that list. Like they were the first team in all of Division I to reach 700 losses. Like they had more losing seasons than they did winning seasons. They hadn't gone, 9-0 since like the 50s. So it was Kurt Cignetti kind of had a tall order ahead of him when he took over this Indiana program. And not only did he have a tall order, he comes in calling his shots, saying where they were going to be at and who they were going to beat. But I think you're right. I think they just needed that little vote of confidence. I had a coach one time, and I was talking about how, I felt confident in the player that I was, but I was always told growing up, like, you always be confident, never be cocky. And I had this high school coach. He told me that, well, if you're not cocky and you don't think that you're the best, why should anybody else think that you're the best? And I think Kurt Cignetti took that to heart because he is getting these, what be basically a group of five, Brian likes to call it a group of five all-star team, to play above their ability. And they go 11-1 this year. They made the first 12-team college football playoff. And if you would have told me on, August 31st that Indiana makes the college football playoff, the first 12 team, but Alabama doesn't, Ole Miss doesn't, LSU doesn't, Michigan doesn't, and all these things, I would have said you were crazy. But here we are, man. It's a reality that we live in. So it's been fun to watch so far. But I mean, first impressions of this Indiana team, man. I mean, they're led by a guy who believes that every single time that his team steps on the field, they are the best team on the field. So they've been fun to watch this year, man.
Absolutely. And they've got a quarterback, of course, talking about group of five all-stars, and Curtis Rohr comes in from Ohio. So when you put the tape in, and I don't know how much Indiana football you've seen. I saw the Ohio State game. I saw the Michigan game. And then other than that, kind of a series here and a series there. Those are the only two games I saw start to finish. And in a sense, those were not the two games, or maybe they were the two games to watch because, of course, Ohio State was clearly the better team. They beat Michigan, but after like the first quarter, Michigan was probably the better team in that game. Certainly held them down to practically nothing in the second half, like 18 yards of total offense in 25 plays. So what are your impressions of the Hoosiers?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I guess I'll start on offense. Well, sorry. As a team as a whole, they are a very hard-nosed football team. Like we've said it all week, what they lack in like that top-end elite athleticism. And I don't want to make it sound like they don't have any athletes on their team. They do. I mean, I've been very high on D'Angelo Pons this year. He's one of their starting cornerbacks. He's a first-team All-Big Ten kid. Elijah Surratt was third team All Big Ten. Like you don't get that recognition if you're just some cat that strolled in off the street and you just play football for the team, right? But, you go through and you look at what this team has done this year. And, there's some people that believe that there's some high-powered, high-fashion, air it out offense. And what they do is they don't have this, phone book, dense playbook. They don't do anything crazy. They're just really efficient at what they do. They have a lot of guys that have played a lot of football. Brian broke it down on one of the Irish Breakdown shows, but we were rattling off the number of snaps that just like their offensive line played. It's 2,000, 2,200, 3,900, 1,800. You look at their starts, they have 148 combined starts just along the offensive line. And so You go through and you look at what they've been able to do, and they've seen a lot of different football. And they've been in a lot of different scenarios. Curtis Rourke is in his 6th year of college football. He spent his first 5 years at Ohio University, and now he's at Indiana. You know, Kurt Signetti brought in 31 transfers. I believe 18 of them are from James Madison, and then 15 of those 31 transfers start on offense and defense. But he's bringing in a lot of guys that are familiar with his system, you know, and so you have guys on defense like D'Angelo Pons and Mikhail Kamara, who are both at James Madison. You know, you had Elijah Surratt, who I think Elijah Surratt went to Ohio with Curtis Rourke. There's somebody on their offense that went to Ohio with Curtis Rourke. So, you know, it goes to speak. There's a lot of people that think, well, they look at what Florida State did in the transfer portal. Obviously, it didn't work out for them. How does it work out with a team like Indiana? And it's because they brought in a bunch of different players. So, you know, what they've been able to do on offense has been fantastic. But the thing that people don't talk about enough is their defense. You know, the number 1 rush defense in the country. You know, they have the number 6 scoring defense in the country. So they're a complete football team. They're a balanced football team, and they're very efficient. Those are kind of my first initial takeaways from Indiana.
Yeah, which leads me to what could be a concern in that Notre Dame, obviously, they don't want Riley Leonard throwing the ball 45 times. They want him to be in the 22 to 25 attempt range, I would think, and obviously dominate with their 2 excellent backs and offensive line. And you bring up Indiana's rush defense. Trying to think, Michigan can run it. Ohio State can run it, albeit with a patchwork offensive line. It's more about the backs being outstanding. And those are probably the 2 best rushing offenses that they face this season. Nebraska's okay running the ball. Washington, Maryland, you know, there was obviously they faced the worst outside of Rutgers, who may have had the worst schedule in the Big Ten. They missed most of the heavy hitters in the Big Ten. And obviously the non-conference schedule certainly is a place to pad stats when you're facing Charlotte and Western Illinois and FIU, as opposed to, you know, picking up 1 or 2 decent teams. So the stats certainly were padded, but I was relating what you were just saying about that rush defense and thinking about what Notre Dame does well and putting those 2 together, and it's going to be strength on strength.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you look at the stats, because especially with Indiana's, you kind of have to look into it with a lot of context, right? I went down and I started breaking down who they played, and it's, you know, they have the number 1 rush defense in the country, and they only allow 70.8 yards per game. I mean, that stat jumps out at you. I mean, allowing 70.8 rushing yards per game is pretty crazy, right? And then you go through and you break it down. They played 8. They played 7 or 8 rushing offenses ranked outside of the top 100 this year in college football. The best rushing offense from a yards per game standpoint that they played was Ohio State, and they ranked 59th in the country in total yards per game, right? Rushing yards. And, you know, you go through, you talked about their schedule, and IU played 2 opponents with more than 6 wins. And one of them was a 5-point win over Michigan, and the other one was a 23-point loss to Ohio State. Now, they played 8 teams with a losing record. So it's tough. But then on the flip side of that coin, you do also have to acknowledge the fact that what they did to these teams, other teams did not do to these bad teams. You know what I mean? So like it's weird when you have to go back and balance, okay, well, you played a bunch of nobodies, but you did to these nobodies what nobody else did. Right. And so that matchup is going to be interesting, because then on the Notre Dame side of the football, you have a rushing offense that is also doing to opponents what nobody else did this season. You know, you can go back and I think, gosh, off the top of my head, I think it's 5 or 6 of Notre Dame's opponents Notre Dame rushed for the most, I guess, of the teams in their schedule. So, you know, you have the Notre Dame run game on one hand that is handing teams their worst loss from a yards per game standpoint. And then you also have an Indiana defense that is holding teams to their season lows, but neither of the teams are like stout run stopping. You know what I mean? So it's interesting when you look at both of those.
Trevor, are you a betting line guy, a guy that likes the odds and the point spreads?
I am. I'm a sports betting guy. So any of
Okay.
the Irish breakdown people in the chat know that.
Okay. So it's kind of curious. Now I know some of these lines this weekend with the 4 games have spread out a little bit, but they all started right around a touchdown to 8
Mhm.
points. Like all 4 games are almost exactly there. And I know Texas has distanced itself to a certain extent. What was your initial reaction to this Notre Dame line? And do you think that's a fair line?
Yeah, I think the initial line was set at 7.5, I believe. And you know, gosh, it's just so tough. I liked it initially, and I'm doing my best to put bias aside here because obviously outside of doing what I do for Irish Breakdown, I also love Notre Dame. But if I'm evaluating it from just strictly a football standpoint, the horses that Notre Dame has on offense and defense kind of outweigh the horses that Indiana has on offense and defense. If Notre Dame is able to come in and play their style of game, I like the spread at 7.5. I do. And I think Notre Dame is they're on like a 6 or 7 game win streak of covering the spread. It's somewhere in there. The closest one I think was USC, and I think they were 9.5 point favorites in that game, and they won by 14. So, Notre Dame has actually been pretty favorable against the spread this year. But, again, it depends on what team shows up for Notre Dame, if I'm being 100% honest with you, Mark, because, again, not to bring it up, this is the same team that I watched on September 7th lose at home to Northern Illinois. Now, that game, I believe, is far enough behind this team, and I do believe wholeheartedly this is a different football team than that. But then when you factor in Notre Dame's history in the postseason in games like this, it's just it leaves a lot up in the air. But if we're talking strictly just football and this team right now, I like the spread.
Trevor, what's your assessment of these other 3 games this weekend in regards to best matchup, best game? Just how do you think they'll go, and the overall field? Do you have do you feel like you've got a pretty good line on who's going to come out on top and how
Yeah,
this is going to play out?
yeah, man. I mean, this is going to be a really fun week of football. I think a lot of people are writing it off that there's just going to be some blowouts because they see a 3-loss Clemson team traveling to Texas, and they see an SMU team going into Happy Valley and playing Penn State. So, but I think that this weekend is going to have some more close games than what people anticipate. Now, with that being said, I do believe that Clemson loses to Texas, and I believe my score prediction for that game, I think I had it at 31-17, Texas winning at home. And it's a similar conversation to what I said about Indiana. I don't know if Clemson has enough horses to compete with who Texas has on offense and defense, right? Like Clemson's rush defense, I think ranks 90th in the country in yards per game allowed. And Texas, when they were at their best, when they beat Florida, when they beat Texas A&M to finish the year, I think Quintravion Wisner, I think, had a combined 59 carries in those 2 games. And they were able to establish the ground game and got it going. They weren't able to do it against Georgia, and you kind of see what happened. But Georgia's rush defense, I believe, is better than Clemson's. So I think that's going to be the ultimate deciding factor. They need to put Quinn Ewers in a spot where he doesn't need to feel like this game is on his shoulders. Quinn Ewers is at his best when he's kind of playing that game manager role. He's a game manager with a strong arm. That's how I like to describe Quinn Ewers. And then with SMU and Penn State, this one's going to be interesting because it's going to be a conversation of like what takes the day. Is it going to be SMU's speed and athleticism, or is it going to be Penn State's strength and size? And, you go through and you look at Penn State, who they just played a very similar offense stylistically to SMU's, run and gun, really fast receivers, shifty, athletic, skilled players. So, I think Penn State has the experience in bigger games like this. We already saw that SMU wasn't able to handle kind of the spotlight that was on them early in the ACC championship game. Now, 2 trains of thought. Did the ACC championship game give them a preview, or it's the first round of the college football playoff? That's a little bit different of a beast playing at Penn State, one of the hardest places to play in college football, versus a neutral location for the ACC championship game. So I think weather's going to play a factor. I don't think SMU is going to be able to play as fast as they want to, but I do have it close. I think my score prediction for this one was 31-28 Penn State. I just think Penn State at the end of the game is just going to be able to grind it out and take the day. And then for Ohio State and Tennessee, this one was a close one. And me and some other people have some disagreeing thoughts with how we think this game is going to play out. But I think out of all the matchups, this one has the potential to be the closest. Like, this was the one that I had the hardest time predicting because, if we fast forward to Sunday and you told me Tennessee wins, I wouldn't really be that surprised. But if you told me Ohio State won, I also wouldn't be that surprised. So for me, it came down to where is each team at? And I think there's a lot of questions in Columbus right now, more so than what's down in Knoxville. You know what I mean? And so when I look and I break down this game, Michigan's coming off of a game where I think Ryan Day's ego got in the way. And I don't think that he played to the strengths of his team. He wanted to try to prove that he could out-physical Michigan. So instead of attacking the perimeter when Michigan didn't have Will Johnson and they had a banged-up secondary, they wanted to try to run it right at Mason Graham. And obviously that didn't work out too well. So it's going to be a question of, is he going to be willing to adjust against a really, really good Tennessee defense, or is he going to kind of let that little voice in the back of his head creep in and say, hey, you're not a physical football team? And now he feels the need to go try to prove that against one of the best front sevens in the SEC. And then on defense, to me, it's going to be a question of if they can stop Dylan Sampson. And I just don't believe that they're going to be able to. So, you go through and you look at, they gave up 155 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns to Jordan James when they played Oregon, and they weren't able to stop Khalil Mullings on the ground either. And so, though they did a good, now I will say the offset, they did a good job shutting down Penn State's rushing offense. So which version of the Ohio State rush defense are we going to get? You know what I mean? So that game I could see going either way, but I do, with all the things going on in the background in Columbus, I have Tennessee winning 23-17.
Yeah, it is crazy because in my situation, of course, I'm trying to cover everyone and stay on top of all these situations and games and do a number of shows with various people. And every one of these matchups is just strictly a football conversation until we get to Ohio State and Tennessee. And it's like this psychoanalysis of if Ohio State's got its head screwed on straight.
Yeah. No, I believe it. I mean, it is weird because Ohio State's a conundrum to me, man, if I'm just being 100% honest. You look at the roster, you look at who they convinced to come back, you look at who they got in the portal, you look at the coaching addition that they made, bringing Chip Kelly in at offensive coordinator. They were the runaway favorite to win the national championship at the start of the season, and with that roster and who they got to come back and who they got in the portal, the minimum expectation was beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, make a playoff run. And I've talked to some Ohio State fans like, well, why is that the expectation? It's like, well, because you're Ohio State. Like, that's the level of expectation when you play at these. When Notre Dame doesn't make the playoffs, not a lot of Notre Dame fans are like, well, it's unfair that's the stigma with Notre Dame. It's like, well, you're Notre Dame. You should be in the conversation every year, So right now, Ohio State's 0 for 2 in those season-long goals, and so I think this playoff run is going to be the last kind of thing. Now, 2 teams could come out and they could either crumble under that pressure or they thrive in it. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was either, if I'm being honest with you.
I'm right there with you. I think Ohio State's a better team, not by a whole lot, but I think they're a better team than Tennessee. But Tennessee's certainly good enough to beat them, no question about it.
Yeah.
I go back to 2022, and Ohio State had a crushing defeat against Michigan. They were undefeated, 11-0. They're supposed to be better, like a touchdown better, 8 points better than Michigan. They lose at home. They get run out of the stadium in the fourth quarter. And they were able to, I thought this team is, and they got to play Georgia, like the most buttoned up team in the country, defending national champs, the team that's got the will of steel, that's played in the big games. And right. I thought, my goodness, but the closer we got to the game, the more confidence I had in Ohio State, thinking, I know from a talent standpoint, they can make this a great game. And of course they did. But they also had CJ Stroud's right arm and they don't have that quarterback now.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because there's a lot of people that talk a lot about, well, Ryan Day doesn't have a big game problem. Ohio State doesn't have a big moment problem. They have a Michigan problem. And I think I would have bought more into that if they still had Jim Harbaugh and if they still had J.J. McCarthy and if they still had Blake Corum and they still had if Will Johnson was playing in that game and some of the offensive linemen that they lost to the draft were still in that game, but it wasn't. Right. And so I think that's what's going to be interesting about what they do to respond now. Ohio State, to me, they have such a good opportunity in front of them to go make a run in this playoff if they just accept who they are as a football team. It's like, hey, you're not a physical football team. And Ohio State's response needs to be like, yeah, that's fine, but you can't guard Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate and Travion Henderson. Like, that has to be the mindset going into it. It can't be this, Ryan Day. I like to call it like the little brother mentality of like, oh, I'll show you, you know what I mean? Like, you just own who you are. It's worked for other teams. It's working for Oregon right now. I mean, that's why their game was so close. Those are two very similar style of teams.
Yeah.
And that's why their game was so close. And so I think if Ohio State just kind of owns their identity a little bit, because I will say, out of all the teams that are going into the playoffs, Ohio State is the one team that I don't think really knows who they are as a team. You go back through and you look at Notre Dame, they're a run first team. They're a team built in the trenches. You go and you look at Oregon and hey, we're going to air it out. You might run for 200 yards on us, but we get a 14-point lead. You're not coming back. Just can't. You look at, Georgia may be in that conversation because question mark of if Carson Beck is going to be playing and, what the extent of his injury is. But, Ohio State, I think, is right up there with who is this team? Is it the Penn State, Indiana version that we saw? Or is it the Nebraska, Michigan version that we saw that's just kind of throwing stuff against the wall and hope that it sticks? And, they were able to out-athlete Nebraska. And I think their game plan as a whole against Michigan just kind of failed them and put them in bad spots. So those are mistakes that you can't make against Tennessee, because I can say with confidence Tennessee has a better put together team and better athletes than what Michigan has right now. So it's going to be interesting, Mark. It's going to be a fun one.
Absolutely. Trevor Trowbridge, Irish Breakdown. And Trevor, anything else you want to let people know about where to find you and what you got going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, Brian and I are going to be going live tomorrow on Irish Breakdown, probably closer to 1:00 to do our game predictions. And we're going to talk through even more so Notre Dame and the Indiana matchup. But you can find us on boards.irishbreakdown.com. That's where you can subscribe and find all of your exclusive content there. And we've been putting out some awesome breakdowns all week about this game. And then, my Twitter handle is down there. And then follow, the Irish Breakdown page. I believe it's Coach D. He said it earlier in the show, and I can't remember the last part of it. But his stuff is all over my page because I retweet anything that he puts out. So also be sure to follow Brian Driscoll on Twitter. So that's where you're going to find all the Irish Breakdown information.
Great stuff. Well, Trevor, great to meet you. Great to have you here. Would love to have you back. Enjoy a historic first playoff game in South Bend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on here, man. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a good weekend.